Be me graphic designer. My corner of the office wasn't really an office. It was more like a machine shop for ideas. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and the low hum of overworked computers. We didn't do small talk. Communication was a series of grunts, brutally honest feedback, and the occasional shared link to something ridiculous. If your design sucked, you were told it sucked. No one cushioned the blow. We didn't have time for feelings. We had deadlines. It was efficient. It was raw. It worked. The foreman of this whole operation was Alec. He wasn't a manager, not officially. He was just the guy who had been there the longest and was undeniably the best. Alec could look at a cluttered mess of a design for 3 seconds and point to the one element that was throwing the whole thing off. He spoke in a kind of design shorthand. Kerning's weak. Hierarchy's inverted. That color combo makes my eyes hurt. It was never personal. It was about the work. The goal was always to make the thing on the screen better. We were a team of mechanics, and Alec was the guy who could diagnose any problem with the engine just by listening to it. Some months back, a project for a big tech client almost went completely off the rails. The marketing department had promised them the moon, and we were given a week to build a rocket ship out of cardboard and duct tape. Everyone was stressing. The director was sweating bullets. Alec just called us into a huddle, took the whiteboard, and in 10 minutes mapped out a new visual strategy so simple and brilliant that it saved the entire project. He didn't ask for opinions. He didn't form a committee. He just saw the solution and laid out the blueprint. That was our world. A meritocracy of skill. You were as good as your last design. Then, the sand arrived. Her name was Valeria from HR. Her arrival wasn't announced with a memo. It was a gradual environmental shift. First came the posters. Stock photos of diverse, smiling people in an office with words like synergy, inclusivity, and empowerment in a soft, round font. They appeared overnight, replacing the old, faded prints of award-winning designs we had tacked to the walls. Next came the smell. A faint, lavender-like scent from a little diffuser she plugged in near her desk. Our corner, which usually smelled like a circuits and caffeine, now had the faint aroma of a spa waiting room. She spoke in a different language. She didn't ask for things. She reached out to create touch points. She didn't have meetings. She opened dialogues to unpack key issues. During her first week, she sent a company-wide email about the importance of mindful communication. It was a wall of text filled with buzzwords. Most of us just archived it without reading. We saw her as a harmless piece of corporate furniture, another bureaucratic layer that had nothing to do with the actual work of designing things. We were wrong. The first real sign of trouble was the big new client, a very old, very conservative wealth management firm looking for a complete rebrand. This was a huge deal, a legacy project. The brief landed in our inbox, and it was a masterpiece of contradiction. The client wanted to project an image of unshakable stability and centuries of tradition, but also wanted to appeal to a younger demographic with a disruptive tech startup energy. They wanted a color palette that was calm and trustworthy like a deep blue, but also bold and exciting like a vibrant red. They asked for a logo that was classic and timeless, but also modern and forward-thinking. It was the kind of brief that was designed to fail. Normally, Alec would have walked straight into the creative director's office, thrown the brief on the table, and explained exactly why it was an impossible task. He would have demanded a new meeting with the client to force them to make actual decisions. And the director would have backed him up, because he knew Alec was right. But something had changed. Alec went into the director's office. We could see them through the glass wall. It wasn't a quick, decisive conversation. It was long. The director was doing a lot of nodding. Valeria was in there with them. Alec came back out looking like he'd just chewed on aluminum foil. He told us the director's new stance. The brief wasn't a problem. It was a creative challenge. We needed to embrace the ambiguity and find a harmonious solution that honors all stakeholder perspectives. That was it. We were on our own, tasked with building a square circle. The first few weeks were a slow-motion disaster. We tried everything. Dozens of logo concepts were created and discarded. We presented options to our director, who would just stare at them blankly and say things like, "I'm not sure this captures the full spectrum of the client's vision." He offered no concrete feedback. He was just a parrot for the vague language of the brief. The team's morale started to plummet. The usual creative energy was replaced by a quiet, grinding frustration. We were just throwing darts in the dark. Finally, a meeting was called. The director, our design team, and Valeria. The client was apparently getting impatient. They hadn't liked any of the initial concepts we'd been forced to send up the chain. The director started the meeting with a lot of passive-aggressive fluff. He talked about falling short of expectations and the need to really dig deep. Then he looked at the team. So, what's the problem here? Why aren't we nailing this? The room was silent. Nobody wanted to be the one to say the emperor had no clothes, except Alec. He let the silence hang for a moment, then he leaned forward. He wasn't angry. His voice was level, measured, the tone of a mechanic explaining why the engine won't start. He explained that the problem wasn't the team's creativity. It was the fundamental impossibility of the task. He broke it down, point by point. You cannot be both traditional and disruptive in the same logo. It's a visual contradiction. You cannot have a color palette that is both serene and exciting. It's a neurological contradiction. He said we weren't failing to find a solution. We were being prevented from finding one by a set of nonsensical constraints. He suggested the only path forward was to go back to the client with a professional recommendation, explaining what would actually work for their brand. He was direct, he was honest, he was doing his job. And then it happened. Valeria, who had been sitting quietly taking notes, held up her hand. "I'm going to have to stop you right there, Alec." The room went still. She had a calm, almost gentle smile, but her eyes were like steel. She said his tone was creating a very negative and unproductive atmosphere. She explained that by using words like impossible and nonsensical, he was shutting down the creative process. She told him his approach felt very aggressive and could be perceived as an attack on the other departments that had worked on the brief. She finished by saying, "We need to create a safe space here where everyone feels comfortable sharing ideas. Your tone right now is making that space feel very unsafe." Dead silence. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Alec just stared at her. He didn't even seem angry, just genuinely baffled, like a mathematician being told that 2 + 2 = 5 for the sake of group harmony. He looked over at the creative director, expecting him to step in, to defend his best guy, to defend common sense. The director just looked down at the table, suddenly fascinated by the wood grain. A total coward, a complete betrayal. Alec slowly leaned back in his chair. A subtle shift happened in his expression. The frustration was gone, replaced by a strange kind of clarity, an acceptance. He nodded slowly. "Understood." And he didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. The meeting ended with no solution, just a vague promise from the director to circle back with new paradigms. The team filed out of the room in silence. We didn't need to have a big discussion about what happened. We all knew. The rules of the game had been officially changed. Facts were now secondary to feelings. Honesty was aggression. Expertise was toxic. That evening, a few of us were packing up to leave. Alec was still at his desk, just staring at his screen. One of the other senior designers, a quiet guy, walked over to him. He just said, "So, truth is toxic now? Got it." Alec looked up at him, and for the first time that day, he had a slight smile, a grim, knowing smile. "Got it," he repeated. The next morning, the machine shop was gone. In its place was a silent, sterile laboratory. The change was immediate and absolute. The casual chatter died. The sarcastic comments ceased. All communication shifted to email and the official project management software. Alec, who had always managed the team by walking around and talking to people, now sat at his desk with his headphones on. He didn't give verbal feedback anymore. He would leave polite, formal comments in the system. Per the brief, please explore a more vibrant shade of blue. It was chilling. We all followed his lead. The entire department of male designers went silent. We became ghosts in the machine. The director wanted a design that was serene blue and exciting red. No problem. We created a logo that used a gradient that transitioned from a calm, baby blue to a jarring, fire engine red. It looked like a cheap toothpaste ad. It was hideous. We attached it to the task with the comment, "Attached is the logo concept incorporating both requested color values. Please advise." There was no more pushback, no more professional opinions, no more creative solutions. We had been told to stop thinking and just follow the instructions. So we did, literally. The brief wanted a disruptive yet traditional font. We found a classic serif font like Times New Roman and randomly slanted some of the letters by 15 degrees. It was an abomination. We submitted it. The director, to his credit, seemed to realize something was deeply wrong. He'd come over to our area, looking nervous. "Guys, what is this? This isn't, you know..." He couldn't even articulate it. We would just stare at him with blank, polite expressions. Someone would respond in a monotone voice. "This version fulfills requirements 3.A and 4.C of the creative brief." He was powerless. He couldn't tell us to be creative. He couldn't tell us to use our professional judgment. Because the last person who did that was publicly shamed by HR for his tone. Valeria, on the other hand, thought the new atmosphere was a smashing success. She mentioned in another company-wide email how the creative department had embraced a more thoughtful and less confrontational communication style. She saw our silence not as a protest, but as compliance. She thought she had fixed us. She had no idea she had just disarmed the entire creative arsenal of the company. The project descended further into farce. We were in a feedback loop from hell. We'd submit a terrible literal interpretation of the brief. The director, too scared to call it terrible, would show it to the client. The client obviously would hate it and provide more contradictory feedback. The new feedback would get added to the brief. We would then create a new design that was an even more grotesque combination of bad ideas, and the cycle would repeat. It was a masterclass in malicious compliance. We were doing exactly what we were told, and in doing so, we were systematically destroying the project. We were all working our normal hours. No one was slacking off. We were just obedient, with surgical precision. Valeria's next move was the final piece of the puzzle. She decided that, while our silent cooperation was good, we needed to take the next step. We needed to learn how to proactively communicate in a positive and affirming way. She scheduled a mandatory workshop for the entire creative department. The topic, nonviolent communication in the workplace. The email invitation was full of promises about building trust and fostering empathy. We all accepted the calendar invite without comment. The day of the workshop arrived. We all filed into the conference room. It was the same room where Alec had been corrected. Valeria was at the front, smiling brightly, standing next to a whiteboard. "I'm so glad everyone could make it," she began. "Today, we're going to learn how to express our needs without resorting to blame or criticism." For the next hour, she lectured us about I statements and empathetic listening. She gave us scenarios. Imagine a coworker misses a deadline. Instead of saying, "You're late," what's a more constructive way to phrase that? She looked at us expectantly. The silence was absolute. Not a single person spoke. We just sat there, staring at her with neutral expressions. It wasn't an angry silence. It was an empty silence, a void. She started to look uncomfortable. Her smile became a little strained. "Okay, well, let's try a role-playing exercise," she stammered, trying to regain control. She pointed to two of the junior designers. "You two, I want you to pretend one of you has designed a logo the other one doesn't like. Let's practice giving gentle feedback." The two designers just looked at each other, then back at her. They didn't move. They didn't speak. The air in the room was getting heavy. The only sound was the hum of the projector. Valeria's face was flushed. She was a performer whose audience had not only refused to clap, but had ceased to acknowledge her existence. She had all the power, officially. She was HR. She could get us in trouble, but in that room, she had nothing. She couldn't force us to participate. She couldn't order us to have feelings. Her entire toolkit was based on people engaging with her ideas. We had decided to disengage completely. The workshop was supposed to be 2 hours long. After 45 minutes of excruciating, unbroken silence from our side, she gave up. "Okay, I see we're not quite ready for this level of interaction today," she said, her voice tight. "We'll take a break. You can go back to your desks." We all stood up in unison, without a word, and filed out of the room. As we walked back to our desks, Alec caught my eye. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear. The silent protest was working. We had found a way to fight back without saying a word. We knew the final presentation to the client was coming up in a few days. The files had already been sent. A portfolio of the worst design work our department had ever produced. It was like we had carefully assembled a bomb, handed it to our director, and were now just waiting to see the explosion. The calendar invitation for the final client meeting sat in our inboxes. It felt less like a meeting and more like a public execution, and we were all ready to watch. The days between the failed workshop and the final client presentation had a strange, dreamlike quality. The silence in our department had solidified. It was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a presence, a heavy, weighted blanket over everything. We continued our work with the same detached, robotic precision. The creative director was a wreck. He started doing these awkward little walkthroughs, trying to engage us. He'd stop by a desk, look at a monitor displaying some new piece of visual insanity, and try to make a joke. Haha, well, that's certainly got a lot of energy, right? We would just nod politely without smiling. He tried bringing in donuts one morning. He set the box down on a central table with a loud, overly cheerful, "Treats are in, team." The box sat there, untouched all day. At 5 o'clock, he quietly put the full box in the trash. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own cowardice, and we were the silent, unmoving walls. He couldn't command us to have morale. He couldn't order us to care. His authority was based on our willingness to participate, and we had collectively withdrawn our consent. Valeria, in contrast, seemed to be thriving. She would walk through our area with a serene smile, as if observing a perfectly functioning Zen garden. She genuinely believed she had engineered a workplace utopia. She saw our silence not as defiance, but as peace. She saw our lack of argument not as suppressed dissent, but as newfound harmony. In her mind, the absence of male toxicity had allowed a new, more thoughtful productivity to blossom. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the flowers in her garden were made of plastic and the soil was poisoned. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to someone from another department in the kitchen. She was explaining how she had successfully de-escalated the confrontational dynamics within the creative team. She said it just took a firm but gentle hand to guide men away from their default aggressive communication patterns. She was taking a victory lap for a race she didn't even understand. The day of the presentation finally arrived. The meeting was in the main boardroom, the one with the huge oak table and the view of the city. It was reserved for the most important clients. Our team filed in and took our seats along one side of the table. We were all wearing the same blank, neutral expressions. We looked like a jury. The creative director was at the head of the table, shuffling his papers, his hands visibly trembling. Valeria sat next to him, looking confident and poised. She was here to provide support and observe her successful project in action. Then the client arrived. It was two people, the CEO of the firm, a man in his late 60s with an immaculately tailored suit and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and a younger man, probably his chief marketing officer. They didn't smile. They sat down, opened their leather-bound notebooks, and the CEO simply said, "Let's begin." The pressure in the room instantly tripled. Our director started the presentation. His voice was shaky. He put up the first slide. It was the main logo concept, the one with the jarring blue-to-red gradient and the weird, slanted serif font. There was a long silence from the client's side of the table. The CEO leaned forward slightly, squinting at the screen. "What am I looking at?" he asked. His voice was dangerously calm. The director launched into a frantic explanation, spitting out a word salad of the marketing buzzwords from the brief. "This design embodies the duality of your brand. The serene blue represents your stability, while the vibrant red signifies your forward-thinking, disruptive energy." He was basically reading the terrible brief back to the man who had approved it. The CEO didn't seem impressed. He just kept staring at the logo. The director clicked to the next slide. It showed mock-ups of the logo on a letterhead and a business card. It looked even worse in application. "And here," the director said, his voice cracking, "you can see the versatility of the brand identity." The younger marketing officer spoke for the first time. "It looks like a logo for a gas station." The director froze. "Well, the vibrancy is meant to be eye-catching." The CEO held up a hand, silencing him. He looked away from the screen and directly at our director. "We are a firm that manages billions of dollars for some of the wealthiest families in the world. Our brand needs to communicate trust, discretion, and unwavering competence. This looks cheap. It looks unstable. It looks like a joke." Each word landed like a hammer blow. The director was visibly sweating now. He started clicking rapidly through the rest of the slides. A portfolio of our collective sabotage flashed across the screen. Website mock-ups with clashing colors. Brochure designs with nonsensical layouts. It was a parade of incompetence. When the last slide went up, the CEO closed his notebook. The sound echoed in the silent room. "This is, without a doubt, the single most unprofessional and incompetent presentation I have ever witnessed in my 40 years in business." He looked around the table, his gaze sweeping over our silent, expressionless faces. "Our contract stipulated that we would be working with a world-class design agency. This is the work of amateurs. I want an explanation, now." The moment of reckoning had arrived. The creative director, cornered and terrified, did what all cowards do. He looked for a scapegoat. His eyes landed on Alec. The fault lies with my lead designer, Alec," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger. "He was responsible for overseeing the creative direction. I trusted his expertise, but he and his team have clearly failed to deliver. There has been a serious lack of professionalism and a breakdown in his leadership. It was a stunning act of self-preservation. He was throwing Alec and the entire team directly under the bus." Valeria nodded beside him, a look of solemn agreement on her face. She was ready to support the narrative of the difficult, underperforming male employee. The CEO's cold eyes turned to Alec. The entire room was focused on him. Alec didn't flinch. He hadn't said a word for weeks, and now, in the hottest part of the fire, he was perfectly calm. He slowly stood up. He wasn't looking at the director. He wasn't looking at Valeria. He was looking directly at the CEO. "You are absolutely right, sir," Alec said, his voice clear and steady. "The work you see on that screen is garbage." The director's jaw dropped. Valeria looked confused. Alec continued, "And it's garbage by design. It is a perfect literal execution of a deeply flawed and contradictory set of instructions." He reached down and picked up a thin folder he had brought with him. "Several weeks ago, I attempted to raise these exact concerns. I explained to my director that the creative brief was unworkable and that it would lead to a poor result." He paused, letting his words sink in. "For doing my job, for offering my professional expertise and trying to prevent this exact situation, I was publicly reprimanded by our HR department for my tone." He looked over at Valeria for just a fraction of a second. Her confident smile was gone, replaced by a flicker of alarm. "I was told," Alec went on, turning his attention back to the CEO, "that my direct, honest feedback was creating an unsafe environment. The priority was not to solve the client's problem, but to ensure that no one's feelings were hurt by reality." He opened the folder and took out a stack of papers. "So, my team and I adapted to the new company policy. We were instructed to stop expressing our professional opinions and to simply, quietly follow instructions. And that is precisely what we have done." He stepped forward and placed the stack of papers gently on the polished table in front of the CEO. "In this stack, you will find every email chain with every piece of contradictory feedback. You will find the original impossible brief. And on top, you will find the official HR memo documenting my aggressive and toxic tone for speaking the truth." He looked the CEO in the eye. "We gave you exactly what we were asked to produce. The failure you see today is not a failure of design. It's a failure of a corporate culture that values comfortable illusions over difficult truths." Then he walked back to his chair and sat down in silence. The bomb had detonated. The room was utterly still. You could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street below. The CEO picked up the papers. He read the HR memo on top first. His expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He then flipped through the email chains. He spent a full minute reading, his face unreadable. The creative director was pale as a ghost. Valeria was staring at the papers on the table as if they were a venomous snake. Finally, the CEO put the papers down. He didn't look at Alec. He didn't look at the director. He looked directly at Valeria. "You are from Human Resources?" he asked. His voice was soft, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had yelled. "Yes," Valeria squeaked. "And it is your professional assessment?" the CEO continued, that when a company is hired to provide expert consultation, the expert's primary responsibility is to manage the feelings of his colleagues rather than serve the interests of the client who pays his salary? Valeria opened her mouth, and a stream of HR jargon came out. Well, it's our belief that a collaborative and supportive environment is essential for long-term creative success. We strive to foster psychological safety, to empower. The CEO cut her off, not by raising his voice, but by simply holding up his hand again. I asked you a direct question. Your company's beliefs do not interest me. My company hired this agency for a high-level professional service. We are paying for your expertise. And you, a person who appears to have no expertise in design or marketing, took it upon yourself to silence the one person who was trying to provide it because you didn't like his tone. He leaned forward. Let me tell you what is unsafe. What is unsafe is my company entrusting its multi-million-dollar brand identity to an organization that allows its process to be dictated by the emotional whims of a glorified guidance counselor. The public humiliation was devastating. It was a complete vivisection of her entire worldview, performed with the cold precision of a surgeon. Valeria's face was beet red. She looked like she was about to cry. The CEO then turned his gaze to our director. And you are in charge here. And you allowed this to happen. You abdicated your responsibility as a leader and hid behind this woman because you lacked the courage to manage your own team and your own client. You are a disgrace. He stood up. His marketing officer stood up with him. The deal is off. We will be speaking with our lawyers about a breach of contract. He started to walk out. Then he stopped and turned back. He looked at Alec one last time. You, he said, with a hint of something that might have been respect. You should find a better place to work. And then they were gone. The aftermath was a strange and quiet affair. There was no big firing. The company was terrified of lawsuits. Valeria wasn't fired. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, they promoted her. They created a new, completely meaningless senior position for her, Vice President of Ethical Culture and Workplace Harmony. It came with a bigger office on a different floor, away from anyone who did any actual work. She was given a budget to organize wellness seminars and write a company blog about mindfulness that nobody would ever read. They hadn't removed the poison from the system. They had just given it its own corner office. They paid it more to stay out of sight. It was the most cynical corporate solution imaginable. The company went into damage control to save the client. They begged for a second chance. The client agreed, but with one condition. Alec, and only Alec, would be their point of contact. He was to have full autonomy, with no oversight from management or HR. Our team was offered a massive bonus to redo the entire project in 1 week. We did it in 3 days. Freed from the shackles of the brief and the fear of unsafe tones, we worked like a well-oiled machine again. The ideas flowed, the honesty returned. We created a brand identity that was clean, powerful, and timeless. It was the best work we had done in years. Alec presented it to the CEO himself. The client loved it. The contract was saved. The bonuses were paid. On paper, we had won. But back in the office, nothing had really changed. Valeria was still there, a ghost in the corporate machine. The director was still a coward. The culture of fear and silence once summoned never truly went away. A few weeks later, Alec invited me and 2 of the other senior guys out for a beer after work. We sat at a table in a quiet bar. We thought it was to celebrate the win. It wasn't. Alec took a sip of his beer and looked at us. "I'm putting in my notice tomorrow," he said calmly. We were all stunned into silence. "But we won," one of the guys said. "They gave you full control." "That's not winning," Alec replied. "That's a temporary ceasefire. The problem is still here. It's in the foundation of the place. We didn't fix the system. We just found a temporary loophole. The next time a Valeria comes along, the same thing will happen." He leaned forward. "I'm done trying to work within a broken system. I'm going to build my own." He told us his plan, a small, lean design studio. No HR department, no VPs of harmony, no buzzwords. Just a handful of talented people who cared about the work. Flat structure, honest feedback. The client is the only boss that matters. "I can't pay you what they pay us, not at first," he said. "It'll be a risk, but we'll own our work. and we'll never have to sit in a non-violent communication workshop ever again. He looked at each of us. So, who's in? There was no hesitation. My story doesn't end with a celebration. It doesn't end with a toast. It ends with a screenshot. It's from a few months later. A shot of the new group chat for our fledgling studio. We're arguing over a font choice for our first big client. The feedback is blunt, sarcastic, and brutally effective. The design is getting better with every comment. In the corner of the screenshot, you can see another browser tab I had open. It's a job posting on a recruiting website. From our old company, the headline reads, "Seeking senior graphic designers to join our dynamic, inclusive, and psychologically safe creative family." They were still looking. They never understood why we left. We didn't leave for more money or a better title. We left because we chose to live in reality. And building your own reality is the only way to truly win.